All right. Okay, so this is a live stream. I am very honored to have Grayson Hawk here. Goes by Grayson Hawk on his channel, Critical Base Theory. You just rebranded your channel, from what I understand, but I also know you're not like in studio, which is why you're not live. You're traveling. Oh, hold on a second. I'm getting feedback here.
Let me mute myself then. Maybe it was on my
Yes.
end. I'm just on my phone. Oh, hello. It's my stream now. Welcome to Dr. Chris Thompson channel. I'm not Dr. Chris Thompson, but he will be back shortly. Don't worry. Momentary technical difficulties, but all will be well. I know Chris was excited to start this stream. Excited to be back streaming on YouTube. All is well. There he is. Hey, Chris, welcome back to your own stream. Thanks
Thank
for
you
being here.
very much. Yeah, I had my YouTube link up, and then all of a sudden you can hear it in the background. So yeah, thank you for covering real quick. So, but you're traveling right now, is what I understand. I saw you just put up a video a day or two ago. Really great. I love that little video of you and Dr. Dino fossil hunting. It looked like you made some interesting discoveries. That's fun. That's really cool. I'm very jealous that you guys did that. But I also know you're like traveling around right now. So can you tell us a little bit about where you're at the moment?
Yeah. So I did a big road trip, like you said. We did a Wyoming expedition to do like a fossil hunting excursion. Just put up that video this week. Really a lot of fun. And like you said, I did kind of rebrand my channel a little bit, like just today, a little bit on a whim. It had been something that I'd been thinking about doing for a while. For those of you that don't know, I guess I'm the artist formerly known as Based Theory at this point, because I up until literally today, I've been going by Based Theory on YouTube, but I mean, people knew me as Grayson as well. Um, but it always kind of irked me when people called me Base Theory instead of Grayson, because I just kind of always thought of myself as Grayson, the host of the channel Base Theory. It'd be like calling Alex Trebek Jeopardy or something. Like, and I was just like, I was like, no, my name's Grayson. You can call me Grayson. It's not a hit. It's not a secret or whatever. I go by Grayson. And so I just like, for people that are new in the channel, that nuance is missed. So I just thought, you know what, I'm just gonna get rid of it and just change the name of my channel to my actual name. So my name is Grayson. My middle name is Hawk. I already, my parents were lucky enough to give me a pretty cool name to begin
Yeah,
with, so I didn't really need to change it for a channel.
gotta
Um,
agree.
my middle name is Hawk because my dad was like a falconer all growing up. He was like obsessed with falcons and hawks, and eagles, and so we always had like a Harris hawk all growing up. And that's why my middle name is Hawk. So
That's
it all
awesome.
kind of checks. Yeah, exactly. So right now, currently, I'm on my way back home. I should be back home and continuing to do my sort of weekly call-in debate, science versus pseudoscience streams that I do, starting back probably this week, later this week when I get home. And I'm going to be announcing the big changes to my channel, including the change in my channel name, and then a little bit of some new format, some new streaming format I'm going to be trying out soon, this next month. So really exciting stuff. I'm excited to be back home. But right now, currently, I am in Rifle, Colorado, which is where Lauren Boebert previously had her home congressional district. And she owned a restaurant and bar named Shooters
Shooters.
here in
That's right.
downtown Rifle, where it was basically like Hooters, but shooters. So all the girls walked around strapped with like guns, loaded guns. I don't know if they're loaded, but yeah. And so you can, that business model was only so long for this world. And nowadays, I'm happy to report I just walked by the building that used to be Shooters,
Mhm.
and it is now a very vibrant and thriving Mexican restaurant,
Awesome.
family owned, doing
Sweet.
very great business
Good.
here in Rifle. So guys, the world is healing.
Yeah, that's true. That's terrible. Shooters. They're so ridiculous. That's hilarious. Yeah, I mean, she's such an absurd person. And, the fact that she was gonna lose, like, that seemed pretty clear because her last election was really, really close.
Yeah.
It was a surprise to everyone. and that she was likely to lose this next one. Um,
In like
she
a safe
switched
district
districts.
for
Yeah,
Republicans.
sure, exactly. Like it would be a district that just about any sort of normal Republican could win, but not someone like totally wacky.
No.
So she had to run away to one of the most Republican districts in the
Yep.
nation,
Yep.
well, at least in Colorado, and something that's like a surefire Republican district. And then there was that famous debate that happened, the primary debate with all the other Republican candidates, with the local TV anchor there, who was fantastic. I don't remember the guy's name, but if you saw clips of that debate, he was so sharp. He was
Hmm.
asking really pointed questions to all the candidates, and I
Interesting.
encourage anyone to check out like highlights of it because it was really
I'm gonna have to check it out. Yeah,
yeah,
but I
it was
was
great.
so if my signal is lagging or
Yeah.
drops or robots or whatever, that's why. It's because I'm just on my phone, like
Yep.
on the road trip. I'm not on a on Wi-Fi or anything. I just like
You sound
pulled
good right
over.
now, which is great.
Yeah,
So
I
I
want to confirm that I'm not driving right now. I did pull
awesome.
over. I'm being safe. Just to
Good.
clarify for the audience out there.
No.
And I was on a road trip as well. On this same road trip, I was in Idaho whenever my car wouldn't start and I had to
What?
wait around for a little while and I had some time to kill while it was like in the shop and they were looking at everything. And that's when I saw that Jimbob was streaming. And
Uh-huh.
so I started watching Jimbob stream. Um, and then I started commenting in the live chat, and then Jimbob started interacting, and eventually goads me into just. I said, you know what the heck? I've got an hour or two. I can call into Jimbob's stream.
Mhm.
So I call in at the behest of the chat and Jim Bob. And the topic of the conversation, what made me call in was about propositions and knowledge and how we can know things are true and false in physicalism. So that's what I went in to talk about. And so we talked about that for, a half hour, maybe a whole hour, talking about
Sure.
physicalism, what is a proposition, what's going on physically in the brain.
Right.
And it was a really long and interesting conversation, honestly, about physicalism that I was actually, enjoying.
Mhm.
And then inevitably, for those of you that don't know Jim Bob, inevitably something set him off, and he ends up, going off into his, bigoted nature
Okay.
of
You I'm only familiar with Jim Bob from one other debate that you had on evolution with him.
mhm.
What's his deal? So he's obviously a conservative commentator, but he's not like creationist or Christian. Like that's not his thing per se, right? Or I really don't
uh,
know.
I
What's his deal?
I say his main deal is that he's like a far right Christian nationalist
Gotcha.
streamer that does maybe reactions to more cultural stuff. So the actual topic of the stream that I started engaging with was, is diversity our strength? So he was mostly just like doing like dog whistling, white
And
supremacy type stuff.
NDA.
And I was going at it as, well, yeah, obviously like diversity in populations is like a strength because it allows you to handle a multitude of different simulations or scenarios differently. And it's like very clear that the evidence shows that diverse populations are stronger, more fit, better populations in almost all circumstances. So I was coming at it from that angle. That's what made me start engaging in that
Gotcha.
stream in the first place. And then it eventually warped somehow into physicalism and the propositions and how we establish truth. And then eventually I said something like, my sense of self or identity is generated in my brain. It's a physical process.
Mhm.
And then he said, no, you're not a you, you're an it. And I said, I'm not an it. My pronouns are he and him. And my gender identity is physically generated in my brain as well. It's another physical process. And that's what really triggered him. That's what really set him off,
Interesting.
is when I
Okay.
declared that my pronouns were he, him. Then he started going, oh, that opened the can of worms into the entire like gender, sex,
Good.
trans issue that
Yeah.
just for the next 45 minutes dominated the conversation. And then after that 45-minute conversation of Jim Bob going back and forth and him asking me really, really stupid, convoluted,
Okay.
hypothetical questions about gender and sex and trans and everything, then he brings in Andrew Wilson. He didn't tell me this was happening. There was no
Mhm.
private DMs or whatever. Andrew Wilson just suddenly joins the chat and basically says, hey, will you debate me? And I thought he meant like in the future or something. I'm like, sure, yeah,
Right.
we can schedule
Yeah,
something. And he's
that's
like,
the
no, like
way the
right
stream
now.
starts. Yeah.
Yeah, he's like, no, like right now, let's debate this like
Right.
topic you were already talking to Jimbob with. Let's me go at it right now. I'm like,
Which
okay, I
was
guess.
crap
Like,
because like you could tell that your signal was not great. You know, you're dropping out. Like you're obviously at a disadvantage if you're
and there's
sitting
a
in your cell
lag.
phone
Like,
waiting for your car to get fixed or whatever.
there's like a second lag in
Yes.
between, like basically when you'll hear them end a sentence and then when I respond, like there's not a lag on my end. Like I'm responding as soon as I hear them finish talking,
Right.
but like listening back to it, it sounds like I'm like, oh, waiting a second,
Yeah.
oh, and then I respond, and it's just like, yeah, it's like stuff like that. It was definitely not an ideal circumstance. So maybe like, I still feel like I did well and
Mhm.
thwarted all of Andrew Wilson's little rhetorical games and traps that he likes to set up. And then eventually he gets angry that none of those are landing and he like does a hit and run basically where he insults me and quits and runs away from the conversation.
Is that right?
Um,
Okay, because I
and,
didn't make it to the end. That's what I was kind of hoping to do
okay, well,
live here.
sorry for spoilers. Sorry for
Oh,
spoilers.
that's all
But I'm
right.
I'm
Yeah.
saying I'm saying I would accept an actual invitation to have a more
Yeah.
formal
Real
sit down
debate.
with Andrew, like preferably in person, so that there's no lag issues. There's
Yeah.
no talking over who's got a better microphone or whatever. Like I
Right.
would talk to the dude in person, ideally, about like we could talk about this subject, but
Mhm.
yeah, for him to hit and run and just take advantage of like the technical disadvantages that I was experiencing. I mean,
Yes.
yeah, not great.
No, because there were times when you would talk over them, but it was obviously because of the lag that was happening, and then they would interrupt you to tell you not to talk over them. But then he would talk over you, and what's his face? Jim Bob wasn't stopping that. He would
I don't
allow that
know.
to go as
I
far as
don't know how to fix that because I
I,
honestly like
yeah,
sometimes in streams it'll seem like when both opponents are talking at the same time,
right,
you'll only hear one of them.
yes,
And sometimes when I listen back on my videos, I'm the one that you hear, and sometimes the opponent's the one that you
mhm,
hear when we're both
sure,
talking. And I don't know what settings on my end I can adjust to
right.
where like if Andrew or Jim Bob talks and I'm speaking, like you can still hear my voice and I'm not just
Right.
immediately drowned out because whatever the audio settings were, anytime Andrew or Jim Bob spoke, like my audio was just immediately drowned out.
It would cut out. So, and we should provide context for who Andrew Wilson is. I don't know his content all that much. I do know that he's also like a right wing commentator, debater. He goes by Big Papa Fascist.
That is, yeah,
And
a self designated label as
now,
Big
the
Papa
way he
Fascist.
describes it, from what I understand, it's intended to be tongue in cheek to
Yes.
point out that like liberals will call everybody fascist, but it's like, but you're
Everything that he
calling
does
yourself
though
a
is that kind
fascist.
of like,
Yes,
oh, I'm just joking
just
if you're
joking.
taking me
Yes.
seriously, but
Mhm.
like, yeah, I mean, it's all everything is tongue in cheek when he wants
Sure.
it to be.
Well, that's one aspect of fascism, is that we're never really supposed to take anything that they say seriously
Yeah.
because,
So
they
the
always have the
Andrew
out that like, "Oh, well, come on. That's obviously I don't mean that."
so
Yes.
Andrew Wilson, otherwise known as Big Papa Fascist, he he self IDs as not a Christian nationalist, but as a Christian populist.
Mhm.
And he has some sort of esoteric explanation for what the difference between those two things are. But we all know he's a Christian
Yeah.
nationalist,
He's a
run of the mill. But he's kind of interesting in that he like converted to Eastern Orthodox, and he feels like
oh,
that's the true strain of Christianity, which is kind
okay.
of weird in America to come across those types or whatever. But I
Yeah.
think Jim Bob also leans that way towards Eastern Orthodoxy. They like have some sort of like arcane reason about why in like the
Okay.
second century, like the lineage of succession, like
Uh,
should have rightly gone to the Eastern Orthodox or something. All makes sense in their mind that that's the true Christianity right there, right?
Sometimes
Um,
that always bothers me because when I hear that sort of, strain from, people who come from more of a Western Europe traditional background or like an American traditional background, and all of a sudden they're embracing Eastern Orthodoxy. I feel like, especially if they're doing it in a very public way and they're these online content creators, it feels as if that could be. I mean, I don't want to get conspiratorial because I don't have any evidence for it, but that there's certainly are avenues by which propaganda in a pro-Russian sense can make its way into these kinds of channels,
Oh yeah, just
right?
it's a complete coincidence that they're
Yes,
all very
yes,
anti-Ukraine and pro-Russia. Just
right,
I assure you, completely coincidence.
yes, right.
But yeah, and so that's Andrew. I first noticed him in a debate he did with Vosh years ago when he was going
Yeah,
by Big
same.
Papa
Yes,
Fascist. And
right.
him and his wife, I think, would do debates together, but I didn't really know that until later. So, anyways, the first time I he really came on my radar was in at the previous Modern Day Debate Con in
Oh,
Dallas. So I was there in person whenever Andrew Wilson was
and
going
he
to
was
debate.
there.
Yeah, he was going to debate Matt Dillahunty, and
Oh, I've
that
heard
debate,
about this.
yeah, it was very, very infamous. It blew up on Modern Day Debate. It's the reason why Matt Dillahunty will no longer do debates on Modern Day Debate,
Right.
because he
Okay.
had a practice of not researching his opponents as a matter of principle
Mhm.
before debates. He did not want to know anything about his opponents.
Interesting.
He wanted to research for the topic, not for the specific opponent, and so he didn't want to know anything about what their arguments would be beforehand. I think foolish move. I
I
mean,
think so
foolish.
too.
Yeah,
Definitely.
I think like
I,
and since debating Andrew Wilson, I think he has said that he has changed that policy,
good. Yes.
because this was a terrible, terrible.
It's
Okay,
very
so
foolish to do something like that. You want
yeah,
to know what kind of arguments your opponent is going to bring to the debate.
and
When
so
I debate, I try to watch as much as I can of the debates that are
yeah,
out there.
exactly. That's because you are smart. Anyways,
Yes. I mean,
so
Mental Honey, he's brilliant, and he obviously is super sharp. He does this all the time, and he wins a lot more debates than he loses. I don't know if I can even point to
yeah.
the debates
Well,
that he really
I don't know
lost,
if it was just like
but
a
that's a bad.
humility
It's
thing or
still
something, but he
yes,
felt like, if he prepares for the subject, the actual topic, then
sure,
that will be sufficient.
yes.
And
You
in
got to
this
do both.
case, it's sufficient if your opponent is good faith and sticks to the topic.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
if you research your opponent and realize, oh, wait a minute, he's not good faith at all, and
Yes.
he probably has no interest in sticking to the topic, then maybe he would not have accepted this debate in the first place, which probably would have been the smart thing to do, because
Totally.
essentially what Andrew Wilson did, they had agreed to debate about like something about morality, secular humanism versus Christianity. What's the better moral framework or foundation, or something like along those lines.
Gotcha.
Matt gives his entire opening talking about secular humanism, its history, its values, its tenets, etc. Great opening.
Mhm.
And then Andrew Wilson goes on and basically says that any moral foundation that makes you forego truth as a value, objective truth as a value in the world, is morally inferior to Christianity. And because secular humanism like recognizes trans women as women, then that is like foregoing objective truth and therefore
Wow.
immoral, and therefore secular humanism is inferior to Christianity. And then he goes on to like really just like drive it in, because if I don't know if those listening know, Matt Dillahunty's like, I think, fiance maybe, but I know that they're at least like in a relationship, boyfriend and girlfriend. I don't know if there's an engagement involved, but um it his girlfriend is like a trans woman. And
Oh,
so then Andrew Wilson it essentially was saying, like calling Matt gay and saying he has a boyfriend, and like it was getting like just ad hom, just really slimy, disgusting
wow.
exchanges. And then Matt was just like, I'm here to talk about the topic. You don't seem to be interested in the topic. And it just got like to where Andrew was just like trying to get under his skin. And he brought his own cameraman into the audience just so that he could chase Matt Dillahunty out when Matt Dillahunty inevitably left. Like they were
I
planning
knew that
on,
he was going to do this.
yeah, they knew that they were going to piss Matt off so bad and just insult him to the point where he rage quits the debate, and that was what was going to make them go viral. And they had the cameraman follow him out into the hallway, Maury Povich style,
Sure.
and they got all their clicks, they got their views and their virality or whatever out of it. It became a huge moment, but that was really what catapulted Andrew Wilson to somewhat of a notoriety as being like,
Mhm.
on the transphobic side of the argument. And
Sure.
now, since he's gone on to have a ton of views and clicks on like the Whatever podcast, basically by
Oh, he's
Like
been on whatever a bunch of. Okay, I didn't
yeah,
realize that.
he debates like 19-year-old OnlyFans models about like why
Yes,
feminism is
right.
cancer and why they're so stupid and dumb, and you know
Anyone who okay,
he's
if
like
you're
in
not
his
familiar with
40s.
yeah, with the whatever podcast, it's bizarre. It's a strange setup. They've got a host who basically asks more or less innocuous questions, but they're always sort of loaded to some degree. They always have one okay, I don't want to say always, but most of what I have seen, it's like one like relatively prominent right-wing talking head, like a oh, who's the ultra Catholic that's on the Daily Wire? Michael
Oh, Michael
Knowles.
Knowles, yeah.
Yes, he's on there pretty frequently. Or it's that kind of level of right wing
Yeah.
demagogue. Charlie Kirk has been on there a few
Yeah,
times.
yeah.
Those kinds of people. But then they're surrounded with like 6 or 8 like OnlyFans
Exactly.
creators. And you're like,
Yeah.
what is this? And so then
Yeah.
he's like debating each of them, but they're also it's a weird sort of psychosexual thing going on a
Yeah.
lot of times. It's gross.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
Andrew Wilson has had several
Okay.
breakout viral moments
Sure.
on the Whatever
Right.
podcast, and those are the real main sources of his notoriety here on the internet. And so he's the one that dropped in on this little talk I was having with
Yeah.
Jimbob,
So I
and it kind
wanted
of goes
to
from there.
yeah, why don't we bring it up? I didn't actually like timestamp things. I will maybe float around a little bit, and I'm happy to pause if you say something, we can talk about it. So let me bring it up. Let's go.
Yeah, you could probably just skip the intro where I just give the background because I kind of
Sure.
already did it, and
I
then we
think
could just go right to when
yes.
Andrew joins, probably.
Okay. So we're gonna do this, and I'm gonna go forward past the intro.
Can
Uh,
a
You're not trans.
okay. Okay.
So for those of you that don't know, that's Jim Bob.
right. That's Jim Bob there. You're on a very bad signal here, as we'll hear.
Yeah.
And I noticed his background, it's like all these little cartoon sort of tropes of like left-wing
Yeah.
folks.
So
Yeah.
he does all those cartoons himself. He's actually
Oh,
like a
awesome.
cartoonist.
Very,
And
very
like, you know, actually some of his cartoons are kind of well drawn. I'll give him that. I'll give him the
sure.
artistry there.
I
But
can see that there's some talent, at least in the drawing part. Yeah.
yeah.
The content it looks like
Yeah, exactly. The
Cis,
content really sucks.
if you're equating man and male.
I'm
I
not
thought you can't equate
equating
those
them.
things.
Again, man is the gender that's typically associated with the sex male.
So what is a man that's not
equating.
tip? Yeah, but what's a man not typically associated with male then? Is that still a man?
Okay, I don't even know what he's trying to say there.
Right? Like I give the distinction between man, the gender, and male, the sex, and then
Yes.
he asks, like, well, what about the inverse of the definition you just
Right.
gave?
But
It's like,
okay,
what?
we have a biological definition of male, right? That can apply to all kinds of animals. Not
Mhm.
all animals, because some animals don't necessarily have just 2 genders. But for most of them, sure. And then man refers to the gender associated with human males in
Mhm.
general. Yeah.
Yep.
But then he asks, well, what about the inverse of that? I don't even know what he really is asking here. Anyway, let's see.
I don't even know if he knows what he's asking. Yeah, it's still a man. It's just a trans man. It's a man
No.
who was born biologically female.
No, hold on a second. You're saying a man is something typically associated with a male, right?
A man is a gender typically associated with someone whose sex is male.
Great. Can a man in another culture be typically associated to a female biologically?
Can a male
Okay, so he goes in with this hypothetical, and I think you probably made it clear that like the first 40 minutes before this is a lot of this kind of thing.
Yeah, that's basically
trying to
all
trip
it
you
is.
up.
Was just asking like very bizarre hypotheticals that just seem to be like, I don't know if this is on purpose, but it seems like they're just designed to be so weird and like out of left field that like no sane person would have ever thought about such a question before to have an answer like packed through. So he's just like trying to like catch you off guard with something you had to think about, or like just some really weird hypothetical that you have to think through for a second and get you on the back foot.
And this is the thing. Okay, so all human beings live in different cultures. And human beings are going to be made up primarily of either men or women, right? At about 50-50 ratio.
Mhm.
And for the majority of those cultures, most of the men are going to be cis men and most of the women are going to be cis women. But when you have someone in the trans condition, that generally means that there is something that has deviated from what is typical so that it's a slightly atypical. It doesn't mean that it's wrong or amoral, but for most trans people, they feel as if they have been trans their entire life, that they have like always felt as if there's been this mismatch of their gender identity from the sex for which that they were born with, right? So this is not an uncommon phenomenon in most cultures. We know that there are cultures that also have this. So this hypothetical that there could be some culture out there where the majority of the men are actually female. So like people who identify as men could be female. Um, okay, I suppose it's possible, but it's incredibly unlikely because so much of this, in my opinion, is largely determined through biological mechanisms. That's where I feel like, okay, there are two main arguments that one can make for the pro trans case, and one of which is a moral argument. We can allow people to have the self determination to live the lives that they want to live. It is a libertarian argument. I think it's a very strong argument, and it's also the easiest argument to make, right? You can say, what difference does it make to me if someone who is born male identifies as a female, as a woman, and wants to live a life as a woman, putting out signifiers that would identify them as a woman, wants to use female pronouns? Why would I care? If it makes them happy, and if it doesn't bother anyone in society, like, beyond like the minor inconvenience or like whatever sort of moral turpitude that they may have with the struggle of the fact that they have to use pronouns that they're going to struggle with,
Oh,
which is
Jim
bizarre
Bob
to
is gonna
me.
make that exact argument.
Oh, really? Okay, because
No,
it's bizarre to me.
that's his final argument, is that it put it that using a trans people's preferred pronouns makes him have such internal suffering and anguish,
So
and and
stupid.
it's against his principles and his religion and everything, that
Right.
he thinks that that if you're trying to use trans people's preferred pronouns out of respect, then you should also have to respect his internal anguish and his internal dysphoria. I mean, it's literally like the most like cry me a river, like I'm such a victim, like I'm going through so much internal anguish, when like everybody knows, like no one is going through any kind of internal anguish like Jim Bob is trying to paint. Just when you try to use someone's preferred pronouns when referring to them, like it's not a big deal
No,
for anybody except these far right freaks like
exactly.
Jim Bob and Andrew.
You look at this person. This is Blair White. I know you know who this is.
Yeah,
She's a trans woman. We're supposed to feel some sort of moral struggle by using female pronouns with this person.
yeah,
That's
like I'm
insane to
supposed
me.
to feel like I'm just like, it's like a huge lie to
Yeah,
call this person who obviously is a woman, like
right.
for me to recognize them as a woman, which I would just uh, casually do on the street without a second thought, like that I'm supposed to have some sort of internal anguish because
Yes,
I'm supposed to recognize
right.
just instinctively that it's a lie, that this is no woman. Whoa.
Exactly. Like, that's insane to me.
No, that's
I
the argument he makes. Like dead
it
ass, that's the argument that Jim Bob makes at the very end of this video, basically.
right. That when you see this individual, you're gonna struggle and you're gonna think that you are lying to yourself and to the universe by using male pronouns for this person, right? Like, or female pronouns for this person. It's insane to me. If I saw someone like this walk into the men's bathroom, I think like, what the hell is going on?
Yeah.
That's crazy. Like, you're in the wrong bathroom, obviously. I wouldn't necessarily care that much. I'm going to go on and live my life. I don't really care too much who uses the men's bathroom. They want to come in and see what's all it's about. But that is someone you would typically associate using with the woman's bathroom. And they would insist that this person needs to use the men's bathroom because their birth certificate says male and that they have to use male pronouns. Otherwise, we are lying to the universe. And it's insane to me. Right. That's a man to them.
You really have to be such a clown to try to make
Totally.
these arguments that they are.
Right. And this is the thing. Most trans people are going to make the effort to put out the cultural signifiers that would identify them as their preferred gender. Obviously, Blair has gone a long distance to do that. Like, she's gone through all kinds of surgeries. She wears lots of makeup. She wears very tight little dresses. Like, these are the things that identify within our culture someone who is a woman. And we know, like, and that's one of the things about like having to use pronouns or like insisting that, like, well, we should always say our pronouns. I think generally most people can identify one's pronouns from the way that they present. Now, if someone
Mhm.
wants to tell me like what their pronouns are, and if I want to go through and like use whatever pronouns they prefer, I don't care. Sure, I'm happy to do that. And I'm not going to struggle with like, oh well, like they look female, but they want me to use male pronouns. I don't care. Like if that's what they prefer, that's what they prefer. But for the most part, like trans people are obviously some of the most sensitive people to what are the cultural signifiers that would indicate my preferred gender, right? They
Mm.
generally are that way. That doesn't mean that they all are that way, right? I don't want to put like paint with a broad brush, but they obviously think about these things a lot. They think about these issues a lot. What are the cultural signifiers that would say I am a woman, or what are the cultural signifiers that say that I am a man? So like it's hardly ever a struggle. So it's just such a stupid issue that like somehow we have to like either be based on birth certificates or genetic tests, which are all of course going to fail in some instances, especially if we talk about intersex issues. Like that's going to be the thing that's going to designate whether we have to use male pronouns or female pronouns, or whether someone is going to have to be using the men's bathroom or the women's bathroom. And that's
Honestly,
mostly the issues, right? Like what else are we talking about beyond that?
honestly, I think that for most of the people like Jimbob and Andrew and these bigots out there, like it honestly feels like, and I really kind of think, I think COVID solidified this for me a little bit. Like it just seems like they have an issue with change, and especially change being forced upon them, where they feel
Yeah.
like it's out of their control. And like, I mean, it's the smallest little minor things, like who's going to what bathroom, or what pronouns you refer to someone as, or like wearing a mask. Like wearing a mask is the easiest thing. It was not a big deal. Like I don't know anybody that was that, like it was not a big deal. It is like putting one on when you go someplace. It's not a big deal to do that. It's not a big deal to put on pronouns, but they make these mountains out of these molehills,
Molehills.
because all of a sudden they have to change something about their lives, and they're not the ones choosing to make that change. That change is coming from society and is being foisted upon them, and they feel out of control, and they feel like there's an authority on their lives, and they don't like that, and they're being encroached upon, and all of a sudden all of these like defense mechanisms go up, and they try to latch on to whatever story seems rational to them, to
Mhm.
where like they can come up with all these excuses about, I mean, you're going to hear Jim Bob and Andrew come up with all kinds of excuses about like these mental gymnastics they perform about why trans women aren't women, or why you shouldn't use pronouns, or why you should be allowed to gatekeep somebody's identity. And like they bend over backwards to try to justify it to themselves, when honestly I think it's really just them resisting
Yeah.
change. And like,
Resisting change. Yes. And
because at this point we have the empirical data, like the scientific studies have done. We know, like, that sex and gender are meaningfully different physical phenomenon that occur in different regions of the brain at different times in development, and that
mm,
trans
I
people's
might argue with
identities are
that,
valid.
actually.
Huh?
I might argue with that.
Okay, well, we can feel free to argue that. I would at least be comfortable as saying, like, I could have sources that I could cite that would support my positing that there.
I think that sex and gender is often deeply intertwined, but that it's that okay. First of all, we don't know what specific brain circuits result in gender identification. That is a fact. We do know that there are certain brain correlates that seem to coincide, just at least as far as size and maybe activity, that seem to correlate with one identity versus another identity. and that sometimes in trans individuals, some of these brain areas tend to be intermediate. In fact, here, let me. I might not even go through the debate that you had here because
we're kind of
I think
hitting
our
most of the
conversation
points.
alone is more interesting than
Yeah, we're kind of
what these
hitting on
guys
most
have
of the
to
points.
say. Let me
Okay,
bring
yeah,
this
here we
up.
go. What I would cite to you, just
Yes.
to support what I was saying, just real quick, the
Sure.
claim that I had made that they are meaningfully distinct phenomenon in the brain, is a new study that just came out last month. It's like a brain imaging study of like 5,000 children. Like it's a development study revealing that gender and sex aren't just distinct from one another in society; they also play unique roles in biology and the brain.
Yes. Okay. I'd be interested to see that. This is a field that I pay attention to, largely related to classes that I take or that I teach. That's not my own specific research. Oh, and I wanted to point out this comment that I have up here. I agree. Like there are obviously sometimes trans people where it doesn't seem very clear that like whatever their preferred gender is, that's the obvious thing that comes from their gender expression. Oftentimes that's the case, though. Usually there are, I think most trans people, the majority of trans people are generally very sensitive to what are the cultural signifiers that would allow one to identify their gender. Now, there are people who are non-binary too. They make up an even smaller minority. And then that's where things become even more complicated. And then that's when you might be using instead of sex identified pronouns, you might be using you pronouns that are not sex identified. All right, so
So
let's.
just to clarify, the study was done by the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development
Okay,
Institute, and it was the largest long-term study of brain development and child health in the U.S.
cool. Okay,
So
and
really
it was
interesting, and it's a very, very recent study. I'll send you
yes,
the link on the
please
article
do.
about it.
Yeah,
I don't have the actual
Mhm.
paper link right now, but I'm just gonna send it in the chat
Yeah.
right
When
here.
that'd be great. I appreciate that. Thanks. All right. So, when we're talking about sex differences, there's things known as sexual dimorphism, where there's like a male typical endpoint and a female typical endpoint, and then there are sex differences. Now, but when we're talking about humans, there really aren't too many dimorphisms. There are some, obviously. Certain secondary sex characteristics generally are dimorphic, but many of them are not. But things like penis, vagina, those are the classic sort of sexual dimorphisms, or testes, ovaries, those kinds of things. Sex differences, though, are things that we know are statistically different between the sexes. There are a number of things that are statistically different, but these are endpoints that exist on a continuum, and that the averages will differ between the sexes. But there can be some individuals in one sex that will overlap, or maybe even be, say, higher than the other sex. Okay, so what was I going to go with this? Oops, I escaped out of that. I didn't mean to do that. Hitting escape. Let's see here. Oh yeah, that's because I exited out of my presentation. And actually, I'm going to move this. 1 second. Let me adjust this because I'm hiding the presentation there.
No worries.
Slideshow. No, we're going to put it on.
But I think that we would both be able to agree that, like,
I think so.
obviously, the exact details of which neural circuitries involved in generating gender identity is still unknown.
Yes.
But overall, the idea that gender identity is a result of like neural circuitry in the brain generating that gender identity.
Right.
I think we could both agree on that, regardless of
absolutely.
regardless of the exact circuitry and how different that is, like how independent that circuitry is from the circuitry that would be linked to more like primary sex characteristics or something like that.
Right.
We could go into those nuances, but I think of the overall picture, we both agree.
Yes, I totally agree with that, and I'm positive we're going to agree on a lot more than we would ever disagree. There might be subtle nuances and that kind of thing, but I think that the biological argument can be a very strong argument in favor of offering validity to the idea that transgenderism is like a real thing, and that we don't necessarily have to just stick with just say the libertarian moral argument that lets allow people the freedom to choose how they would like to live, right? That yes, we should embrace that as sort of a principle of liberal societies. Um, Allow people to live the way they want to live, as long as it's not affecting and harming other people. As long as it's not creating substantial harm to other people. Um, that it, you know, if it makes them happy, great. That's all that we should really care about. However, I think that we would be neglectful to skip over the strong biological argument that there is indeed a case to be made that those individuals that identify as transgender may have underlying biological features that would explain why they have this behavioral feature. Right. And so Phantom X11 here is pointing out that there is like questioning whether there really is a distinction between differences and dimorphism. What I mean for the differences here, dimorphism really refers to shapes. So like substantial differences in overall shape of morphology, those are dimorphisms, penis versus vagina. It's not just an issue of difference, it is a degree of kind, essentially. Now, a sex difference is there are a lot more sex differences than dimorphisms in humans and most animals. A sex difference might be something like height. So, in general, on average, men are going to be taller than women, but there are going to be obviously some women who are quite tall. And I think I got a little thing that explains that. I might not have that in this one. It's really funny. It refers to someone who's very tall, which is Brienne of Tarth from Game of Thrones.
Nice,
for people
nice.
that know her. And then I throw up a picture of a man who is relatively shorter than the average woman, is Ben Shapiro. Someone who clearly is a man, identifies as a man, but is below average, even below the average of women when it comes to height.
Wow, what a power couple, Ben Shapiro and Brienne of Tarth.
Can you imagine? So, the thing is like getting to, when we have, I'm going to skip over this because that's less important, but we have two gonads, right? When we are talking about the development of what is male and what is female, there's a lot of steps involved, right? So obviously we've got the chromosomes. This is the karyotype of a human male. 23 pairs of chromosomes. The 22 of them are equal in size, but when we're talking about a male, the 23rd pair is where we have the X and then the Y chromosome. So the X chromosome has something on the order of around 1,000 genes. The Y chromosome has about 20 functional genes. It's quite small. I often see these funny stories of like, oh, the Y chromosome is going to disappear at some point. I actually am planning on doing a video on how stupid that is. Like the human Y chromosome might disappear. Like it's just okay, that's stupid. All right, but I digress. The thing is, though, the Y chromosome has a gene on it. It's called SRY, which is sex. What is it? Sex defining region Y, I think is what it's called. The SRY gene turns on a number of genes. The one that's most important is SOX9. So SRY turns on SOX9. Okay. So what happens is that gene will not just be expressed in the entire body. It especially gets turned on in the what's called the protogonad. So early on in development, I'm going to skip to this next part before we talk about this. The protogonad is, or the bipotential gonad is the tissue in the developing embryo that has the potential to turn into either an ovary or a testis. So if an individual is XY, what will typically happen is that the SRY gene will get turned on. That'll turn on the expression of SOX9, which will drive and then SRY plus SOX9 will drive the expression of testicular genes and typically turn off genes that would normally turn the bipotential gonad into an ovary. So the default position is for the bipotential gonad to turn into an ovary. But if you have an SRY gene, you're going to get lots of SRY plus SOX9 driving these testicular genes to turn on and turning off ovarian genes, which eventually turns the bipotential gonad into a testis. And then the testis will then descend, and the testis will also start to synthesize all kinds of hormones, which we will get into. I'm going to skip ahead. Okay, So this is another very important thing. Okay, well, let me go back. So basically, if there's an S or Y, we're going to end up with testes, and certain features that are found in all embryos will disappear, such as like the things that would turn into fallopian tubes. They will disappear, and then the things that are going to be more male-like will be retained. And then if there is no functional S or Y gene in an embryo, well, then you will have ovaries that'll develop, and then those things that would be needed to allow those that would be needed for a typical male disappear, and then things like fallopian tubes get retained, and then you have the development of the uterus and that kind of thing, right? So that there's a lot of steps going on, not just the XY part, but then there's another thing that has to happen, which is hormonal organization of the developing embryo. So early on in development, in utero, in mammals, there is this huge surge in circulating testosterone, right? So gonadal hormones go way, way, way high in the developing embryo. So the testes start pumping out all kinds of testosterone. The level of testosterone that gets into the developing male fetus is about the same level that one will experience at peak puberty. So it's a lot of testosterone that's hitting that developing fetus. In females, what you can see is there's absolutely no circulating sex steroid hormones. There's no estrogen, there's no testosterone. So none of that is actually hitting the developing female fetus. Okay, all of that is hitting all parts of the body. So it's leaving the testes, it's going around the body. It causes the clitoris to enlarge and turn into a penis. It causes the labia to fuse to turn into a scrotum. The testes then also descend and fill in the scrotum. It causes the disappearance of the female parts and also the full development of the other male parts to allow the testes to be fully connected. All of that organization of just the reproductive system is being driven largely by this huge surge in circulating testosterone. That's not the only thing, though. It also is going up into the brain and causing changes there, which we'll talk about. So then, once the baby is born, there's oftentimes another quick surge of testosterone right at birth in human beings. This is true in some other animals too. And sometimes this is even further delayed because oftentimes human beings have a long in uterine development. But eventually it just goes down, and then basically circulating testosterone levels are at basal levels all the way through juvenilehood. And once you start to reach adolescence, that's when puberty starts to hit. And that's when you get the sex steroid hormones hitting both now the male and the female. Of course, in males, it's typically a large amount of testosterone that they're experiencing. And in females, it's cycling estrogen that they're experiencing. That acts on the body in different ways in both of those individuals. Males obviously get the deepening of the voice, they get body hair in certain places. They changes behavior, obviously, too. This is also true in females in that they have changes in behavior, but it also changes some of their morphology. They grow breasts, all kinds of things. I don't have to describe puberty to you. Certainly not you, Grayson, and not even to the audience. But anyway, so hormones are playing a big role in all of this. And the thing about hormones is that it's complicated. Like you can have experiential effects of hormones that are heavily influenced by environmental factors and developmental factors that can alter the trajectory of an individual fetus. So if a fetus is experiencing some kind of hormonal disruption early on in development, that can lead to substantial effects on morphology, but also behavior. And we know that this is the case in rodents because we can do those manipulations and experiments in rodents. It's also true in humans because we can see this often from intersex cases. And it results in behavior that tends to be mixed. It tends to be not fully male, not fully female, not the kind of gender identifying signifiers that would be normally consistent with male phenotypes or female phenotypes. Sometimes it's the opposite of whatever the genetics was, and the XY versus XX, and sometimes it's a blend. And oftentimes we call those individuals intersex. Um, People who are transgender, sometimes it turns out that they actually have some kind of intersex condition and they don't even know it. So, are you familiar with Klinefelter syndrome? Do you know what that is?
Yeah, is that where there's like okay, it's either where there's an additional chromosome, or there's like additional hidden ovaries that they didn't even know about, right? One of
So
those two.
it's the first one. So they have
Yeah.
an additional chromosome. So they are XXY. So they are almost always physically identifying as male, but they are 10 times more likely to identify as transgender than people who are just XY. Um, so having that extra X chromosome, there are certain genes that are on the X chromosome. So there's this thing known as like chromosome loading. So females obviously have two X chromosomes, and having two X chromosomes means that you get more gene products from both of those X chromosomes. Some of that is will define certain female characteristics. We don't know fully exactly how this works, but that kind of chromosome loading is also part of the genetic role of defining male versus female or man versus woman. Uh, Having an extra X chromosome, even if you have a Y chromosome, means that you're getting a lot more of those X chromosome products. And it results in some physical features that are often associated with female characteristics. Now, most people who have Klinefelter syndrome tend to identify as male, but they are 10 times more likely to identify as transgender. So there was this interesting study that was done where they looked at a whole bunch of transgender individuals and they just looked at the incidence of Klinefelter syndrome, and they found 10 times as many Klinefelter syndrome people who were born male but identified as female than what they would have expected by chance. So that tells you already that, like, okay, the issue of transgenderism often must involve some aspects of things that we often associate with just being intersex, but it isn't strictly just intersex, right? Like, so for those individuals that are transgender, those may be certain kinds of intersex conditions or even just transsexual conditions that where something biological has happened to the brain that we don't even necessarily fully understand, that the circuits that are important for defining gender identity and just sex, I don't necessarily disconnect those things completely. I think that gender identity and sex is often related to each other, but they're not exactly the same thing. But regardless, they are the result of the activity of those brain circuits that are important for that define those features, right? And inevitably, like, that's going to lead to um you know if there are things that have happened in the course of development, or if there's a certain genetic condition that has altered the development of those circuits, it's inevitably going to affect some individuals, resulting in this kind of change, right? That's the point that I think needs to be made, and there's a lot of evidence to support this idea that for many individuals who are transgender, that they have brains that correlate with the fact that they are transgender, and that it isn't entirely just a choice that they made. It's not entirely just like, oh well, one day I woke up and I decided to be female, right? Like, I have um most people who identify as transgender feel like as if their entire lives they have not necessarily matched their physical body, that the birth sex they were assigned at birth doesn't actually match what their mental image is of the gender that they identify as. And then for those individuals that are non-binary, there probably is something in between it, that they have, like, there probably are complicated circuits that are involved in overall gender identification, and also our sex, and our sex preferences, who we would like to have sex with, whether it's the same sex versus the opposite sex, or just not being interested in sex at all. Those are all things that are tied up in gender identification, and you can imagine people having just subtleties in the organization of those circuits that don't make it so clearly bimodal. It's definitely bimodal, but bimodal doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't some overlap, right? And that overlap means that those individuals do exist. Even if they're in a minority, even if they're in a small minority, it doesn't mean that they don't exist. They definitely exist. And we have definitely, like, the biology and an understanding of just how complicated this process is to understand that, like, obviously it's going to result in these kinds of things, that you're going to have some individuals that'll have a blending of that. I've been going on and on. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's a really important point to bring up the biological aspects of gender specifically, because like on both sides, even I've seen this aspect being missed. Like I've seen like allies making the argument saying, like sex is, biological primary sexual characteristics, and then gender is like the non-biological aspects of being a man or woman. And like to a degree that's true. Like there are non-biological aspects where, it's talking about the kinds of clothes you wear, the kinds of, your performative roles in societies and in social settings. But like it's true that culture and social interactions and all those things play into your gender identity, but they also have an impact on the events going on in your brain. And it's like a loop between your
Yes.
brain's outputs and then the inputs into your brain from your environment. And so there is a role for biology when you're talking about the construction of somebody's gender identity in their brain. And it's taking inputs from their environment, from culture and social interactions and all these really, really complicated web of inputs. And there's going to be genetic and epigenetic inputs, as well as hormone, like you just what they were exposed to in their environment. Like there's going to be so many complicated factors that are all feeding into this neural circuitry that's going to be generating this person's sense of who they are, what gender feels right for them, like what they lean towards. Like, I mean, we all have this inherent sense, this or I guess maybe there could be some edge cases of people that actually maybe they don't have the neural circuitry generating a sense of gender at all, which would be interesting to examine as well. But
Yes.
like there are so many different kinds of possibilities for different nuances that these neural circuits could take on for the different types of gender identities that are generated, that trying to reduce it in such a black and white way that the transphobic community often does is just missing the actual rich scientific reality there.
Yes. They miss the rich scientific reality, and they like to, I mean, essentially, they will argue their case from a third grade biology textbook level, right? That men have XY, women have XX, and obviously, if you're a man, you've got XY chromosomes, you got testes, you got a penis. That's it. And if you're a woman, you've got a vagina, you got ovaries, you've got estrogen, and you've got XX chromosomes. And my point is that the developing embryo is actually something that is in between both male and female, whether you're XY or XX. Eventually, there's this whole suite of genes that get turned on, and even some of the subsets of genes, sometimes like SOX9 can be broken, which actually has a great effect on the development of the embryo, resulting in largely conditions that result in female forms. So it's not as simple as like, oh well, XY just simply means man and XX it results in woman. In fact, okay, so I wanted to uh, go over this. This is an interesting set of experiments that show like the role of hormones in organizing um, male and female sex preferences in rodents. So we think of hormones, especially testosterone, having this organizational effect early on in development. And so we refer to that as that sensitive period, and that's why you have this big difference between males and females in mammals, where there's this major surge in testosterone in males and not any kind of hormone change that's happening in females. And that happens during the sensitive period. So this is referring to embryonic day 18 in rodents, postnatal day 0 in rodents, and postnatal day 10 in rodents. So this is generally the sensitive period when their brains are particularly sensitive to the exposure to testosterone that will result in changes in sex behavior. So this is if you're a rodent, this would be pornographic in some ways. So this is the way rats get it on. They got the mounting behavior, and then the female is showing what's called lordosis. She sticks her hind end up. Um, Hormones obviously play a role later on in adulthood. They activate the brain circuits to say, hey, like there's a reason why hormones have to turn on during puberty, because it's what says like, oh, I'm a male rat and I want to get it on, and I got to go out finding female rats. That's what hormones do. So they activate those same brain circuits. Something similar is happening in humans too. Any middle school grade teacher would know that
Pretty
as
much
well.
the exact same thing, I would say.
Yes, it's essentially the same thing. Yes. So one thing that's super interesting is that, okay, in males, so what will happen is that a typical male will have a testosterone surge during development, and then as an adult, the luteinizing hormone, which is the hormone that is released from the median eminence from the anterior pituitary that acts on the testes that causes the testes to release testosterone. It's pulsatile. Luteinizing hormone goes up and down. It's a really easy hormone to measure in blood. So a lot of times, if we just want to look at, well, what is the hypothalamic pituitary gonad axis doing, the HPG axis doing, we can just look at levels of LH. And so if we see it's cycling usually about 4 times every day, that would be an indication of a male. And then if it's just maintaining this going up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. A female will not experience a testosterone surge during development. What will happen for a typical female is that her LH will also go up and down a little bit, but then she'll have this really strong increase in LH that happens. That's shown right here. So that LH will go way high. Luteinizing hormone will go way high. That's what that's doing, is causing a huge increase in estrogen, which is going to cause menses and menstruation in women, and it causes estrus in rodents. There's some subtle differences between them. We're not going to get into that, but they're basically the same thing. So the pattern is different. If you take a male rat right after birth and you castrate it, as an adult, it will have an LH pattern that is typical of a female, of an XX female. So this is an XY male, and all you've done is just remove the testes. Its pattern as an adult, its LH pattern will be female-like. And if you take a female baby pup, and if you give it testosterone early on in development during the sensitive period, it results in an LH pattern that is typical of male rats. So they will never have this increase. They will only have pulsatile changes that occur. So all that you've done is just caused either the male rat to have a more female-like experience early on in development, or the female rat, the pup, to have a male-like experience early on in development. And now as adults, they're now experiencing the opposite HPG pattern of activity that is opposite of their genetic sex.
And are their behaviors intermediate, or are their
No,
behaviors
they're
that
actually
of
very opposite. So it turns out,
interesting?
so what happens is that so if you have a male who has a normal male experience, that male will do mounting behavior. But a male who is castrated, so this guy who got castrated as an adult, so the non-masculinized males, what we refer to them as, they will do lordosis. So they will raise their hind end, even though they don't have a vagina, they have just a penis. They will raise their hind end to other males and will allow the male to try to mount them. Now, not much is happening there, but that's what happens. For females who experience testosterone early on and are given testosterone as an adult, right? So having those activational effects as an adult, as long as she got testosterone also early on, she will do mounting behavior. So she will act like a male and try to mount other females, even though this testosterone treated female does not have a penis. So they show the sex like behaviors that are very opposite to their genetic sex. But they have to have that organizational difference. If you do this as an adult, if you just castrate an adult rat that had a normal testosterone surge, that they won't mount as much, but they will never show lordosis. They'll never show this. And if you take a female rat that had normal development, and if you give it testosterone, it's not going to do mounting behavior. It will have some problems doing reproduction, but it's not going to mount like a male. It
And I
has to
think
have had that early developmental change.
I think like the processes that occur over the course of development, specifically like early development and especially in puberty, are really the key in like the interplay between how sex contributes to gender, and like how closely correlated the two are, how independently the two are developing, what other factors are contributing to the development of one and not the other, and those kinds of things are all
Sure.
at play, and all really, really impactfully at play in
I would
that
agree,
development.
except that I think actually more of the emphasis is what happens in utero. I think that what's happening for most transgender individuals is that something has happened during uterine development that has affected the brain circuits that are involved in gender typical type behaviors and gender identity, and that it has resulted in individuals that have either a blending of both sexes or are opposite to what is the genetic sex. Remember, these are like XY and XX individuals. Like they're as genetically quote unquote normal as we can make them, yet we can get them to do behaviors that are essentially like strictly homosexual in nature. And I mean, we can't obviously identify, we can't ask them like what their gender identity is. But one thing that is tightly correlated, often the case with overall gender identity, is that most individuals who identify as a male or a man are going to be heterosexual. They're going to prefer the company of women. And most individuals who identify as a woman in human societies are also going to be heterosexual and prefer the company of a man.
Yeah,
And
are
here,
you catching or are you pitching?
yes, essentially, right? And the thing is, like, what I think has happened with the transgender community is, and like, with it getting sort of like becoming more prominent, and that there's a lot more attention being paid to it. I think that what's kind of happened is that society has gotten more accepting of just homosexuality overall, and but that it was a lot less accepting of people who are gender atypical. And so, say in the 80s and especially in the 90s, when say homosexuality was being more and more accepted, it was clearly not being accepted by the conservative community, but now they have completely given up on it. It would be really hard for, say, someone who is very effeminate in their nature, who was born a man, still very effeminate, preferred the company of men, but would be transgender, because that just wasn't accepted in society. And I think that now some of those individuals, and I'm not saying that all gay men are effeminate, because clearly they're not. Like, there are plenty of gay men who identify as men, they are cis men, but they are gay. But there are some who obviously have an effeminate nature, who behave more effeminate and more female like. Um, some of those individuals back in, say, the 80s and the 90s, they would have been dissuaded from being transgender, but are more fluid in their gender at the very least, and maybe would be considered trans today if they would have had the opportunity to have that ability, right? And then also the same would be true for the female case. I don't know. What are your thoughts about that? I don't want to make it sound as if, like, I want to be careful of LGBTQ,
Yeah, yeah.
right?
I think that, like, the background biology has pretty much been a constant presence in human populations, where it's like some degree of natural background variance in human biology, gender, and sex is going to produce some amount of, like, homosexual people, some amount of trans people, like, just as a constant, it just as a part of human populations just
Right.
throughout history. And then, yeah, like you said, there's going to be cultural factors that are either going to, like, suppress that
Yes.
or are going to be open to that. And I think that you're, like, largely right in like the
Yeah.
trends that you're talking about, where, like, yeah, I mean, like, there are
So they're
so
like,
many
actually,
older
that's a great point.
there are
The
so many older people in the
Yeah.
trans community that I will hear regularly. Like, they'll say, I didn't even know that being trans was an option. Like, I've always
Yes.
felt like this, but I didn't know that's what it was until I was,
Exactly.
like, in my 30s even. And then I figured out, oh, I'm trans. Like, I didn't even know that that was a
Right.
thing that I could be until now. So it was like they had to have seen that in the cultural milieu to even realize that that experience is what they identify with as well.
Right. There are some cultures, and the cultural aspect is actually an interesting point to that, because there are some cultures that have a little bit more of an understanding that there's a small subset of individuals that don't necessarily identify as like their biological sex, and they even have like a separate designation for them. And oftentimes, like, it's usually the case that it's going to be like these very effeminate men who are just allowed to sort of live as effeminate men. And they even have, I don't know all the details because I'm less more anthropologically focused, but I've remember reading up on it several years ago, and it's some parts of South America, like especially amongst like Native American type societies where it's not so dominated by like strict Catholicism and Spanish sort of influence, where they're a lot more flexible about
Hmm.
that. Oh, there's a subset of individuals. Some boys will be somewhat feminized, and it's okay. Like we just will think of them as being sort of separate.
Yeah, there's I think the notion of like two spirit people,
Yes, the two
which
spirit thing. Yes, and more
yeah,
North American native tribes.
there's
Yeah.
also a certain like class of people in I think a particular region in India that are viewed as a third gender,
Mhm.
and other parts of Southeast Asia as well have a
Right.
history of it. Like there, multiple different cultures have recognized this as a phenomenon in human populations.
Exactly. So the thing is, okay, this phenomenon of this behavioral transition that occurs in rodents, we actually have a pretty good understanding of what's happening even within the brain. So there's an area of the hypothalamus known as the sexually dimorphic nucleus of the preoptic area, or the SDNPOA. This is what it's called in rodents. In humans, it seems like the homologous regions for these brain areas are a little bit more complex. Our brains are a lot bigger, so it seems like as if the SDNPOA is actually broken up across a couple of different brain regions. I do have some slides on that. We might get to it. But the thing is, it's called the sexually dimorphic nucleus of the preoptic area because when we look in the rodent brain, we don't see too many brain regions that are like strictly sexually dimorphic. But this is one of them, and that's why it has the name. It's called the sexually dimorphic nucleus of the preoptic area. So this is a cross section, a coronal section of the brain. This is the third ventricle here. This is the optic chiasm. So we're pretty low in the brain in the hypothalamus. This is a female, and then this is a male. I'm going to bring up my laser here. Major options. So the male is bigger than the female. So this is the female. It's very, very tiny, and the male is bigger. If you treat female rats during that critical window, they result in having an SDNPOA that is bigger than than females who are untreated. And for males that get gonadectomized during development, they end up with an SDNPOA that is smaller, that looks more female-like than it does in males that are intact.
I'm sorry. Can
So
I just stop you right there for a
yes,
second? I've never heard this term before. Gonadectomized?
gonadectomized. Yes.
Brutal. Oh my
I know.
god.
So that I did a lot of gonadectomies when I was a PhD student. When I was working with birds, so I was working on the brain circuits that regulate singing behavior in songbirds.
Mm.
This brain circuit is typically used for reproductive behaviors. It often is much bigger in males than it is in females. And we were studying seasonal changes in these brain circuits. So these brain circuits generally, when animals are in breeding condition, their testes get 50 times in size. They grow 50 times in size. Their testosterone levels go from basically undetectable levels to 10 times the circulating levels that is typically seen in a healthy, like a teenage boy. So they have this huge
Damn.
swing in testosterone. Yeah.
Is it
So
breeding season or are you just happy to see
that's
me?
pretty exactly. Well, you know what's going on. So now they're all randy, they're ready to go, but the testosterone gets way up into the brain and it starts acting on these brain areas and it induces major changes, so seasonal changes in these brain areas. So in males, these brain areas will grow in size to coincide with the breeding conditions so that they're now going to be singing their heads off and trying to attract mates and repel males. And then what I studied as a PhD student is what happens when they transition from breeding to non-breeding conditions. So the testosterone goes away. How do those brain circuits break apart? So I had to gonadectomize all kinds of birds. Now you probably recognize this. Never seen a bird flying around with a scrotum hanging behind it. It's not terribly aerodynamic to have a big old scrotum hanging behind it. So birds don't have a scrotum. Their testes don't descend. So the testes are found way up inside the body. So I had to do laparoscopic surgeries on male birds. So I'd have to reach in and suck out. I'd have to break it apart and then do via vacuum aspiration the gonads, the
Wow.
testes in males. And yeah, we refer
Jeez.
to that as gonadectomy. Mhm. So I've done it myself.
Wow. The more you learn something new every day.
I know, gonadectomized. It's a great word. I love it. It just comes right off the
Yeah,
tongue.
that's a fun fact to share at the dinner
Yeah,
at the dinner
exactly.
table, boys and girls.
But it's crazy that if you do it during this critical window, you end up with male brains that are female-like in this SDNPOA, and that if you give just baby female pups testosterone, you will end up with a male-like SDNPOA. And we know that if you lesion the SDNPOA, it has substantial effects on their overall ability to engage in sexual reproduction. So these are brain circuits that are clearly involved in their interest and motivation to have sex, and that between the sexes they are different, and that you can get male and female like forms in the opposite genetic background by manipulating the overall hormonal network. So it's super
Wow.
complicated. And so you could imagine conditions in human beings environmentally that will result in some of these changes. And I don't have a slide for this, but there's this amazing phenomenon that occurs in rodents. So in the rodent condition, in a developing uterus, it's okay. A pregnant rat will have maybe 8 or 10 pups or something like that. There'll be a bunch of pups in there, and the genders of the pups, I should say, the sex of the pups are more or less random. So if you've got, so they have these long uteri that are sort of Y-shaped like this, and you might have 4 or 5 on this side, and then 4 or 5 on this side. And then, so you might have a string of females that just happen to be right next to each other. So you'll have a female, and a female, and the female that's in between the two females will have no males, obviously, next to them. But on the other side, you might have a male, and then you'll have a female, and then you have another male. So that female is now sandwiched between two males. Now, remember, in development, these males are having this surge in testosterone. We know that the final behavior of a female that is stuck between two males in utero as an adult is going to be different than a female that is stuck between two females in utero in rodents. So
Wow.
a zero, we refer to them as 0M females. So 0M meaning they didn't have any males next to them. They generally are very good mothers. They do very good mothering behavior. They tend to have high reproductive success. 2M females, so females that are stuck between two males, they tend to have very poor reproductive success, and they tend to be terrible mothers
Because they have very masculine behaviors.
because they got masculinized in utero because they happen to be sandwiched between two males, and enough of the testosterone
Yeah, it's like secondhand
circulated.
smoke.
Yes. So enough of the testosterone came out of the two males and got up into her brain and affected and caused some changes in her brain that made her somewhat masculinized. Now, not fully masculinized like this. They're not necessarily going to do mounting behavior as like a female would if you give them like a substantial amount of testosterone. But if they get exposed to just enough testosterone, that can be enough.
Hmm. Yeah, like our brains are just so insanely
Yes,
complicated to
incredibly
where like
complicated.
there's just so many different factors that can just nudge it to develop in
Yes,
this way or nudge it to develop in this way where you can have just being able to try to track it to say, oh well, what is it in this
yes,
person's life that made them develop this
absolutely.
behavior or this identity, or
Right.
trying to trace it back, and it's just like so hard because it's
Yeah,
so multivariate. I mean, the brain is
absolutely.
just so immensely
Yes.
complicated
And
in
it and it doesn't it's not necessarily even just strictly hormonal. Like, you could have just a change in gene expression that will affect, say, the downstream effects of a hormone system. So, like, maybe you might have a typical male that would have this surge in testosterone, but, if that male has a broken androgen receptor, for instance, that male will end up having a vagina, will end up having testes, uh, but will identify as a woman and won't even know that she has XY chromosomes, that she has testes, and that she has testosterone until she reaches the typical age of puberty, because she won't start menstruating because she doesn't even have a uterus because she was
wow.
born with XY. Yeah, so this is known as androgen insensitivity syndrome. So this is an intersex condition. And in fact, I think I have slides on this.
Yeah, I mean, just like the amount of diversity in like the tapestry of different, like, yeah, just along the distribution on the spectrum of sex and gender is
Yes.
just like
Right.
there's just so many different varieties that
Yes.
like these different these different biological, cultural, and social aspects can just like the confluence of them can create just such a wide myriad
Absolutely.
of
Even if you
identities.
take just strictly the biological steps, I mean, this is a highly simplified version of the steps involved in getting to a male brain versus a female brain. And this is already clearly very complex. So that's some of the stuff I think I have this. Yeah. So, complete androgen sensitivity syndrome. So, these are individuals that are born with XY chromosomes. They have a mutation in the androgen receptor. They have testes that don't descend. And the reason why they don't descend is because even though the testes, they have XY chromosomes, they have an SRY gene. The SRY gene turns the bipotential gonad into testes. The testes start producing all kinds of testosterone, but the testosterone doesn't have anything to act on because the androgen receptor is broken. So they have this shallow vagina, but they have no ovaries. They do develop breasts and hips at puberty, but they are reproductively infertile because they don't actually develop a uterus because they don't have because they have XY chromosome arrangement. Um and the testes form as like a male type thing. So they don't actually uh even know that they have this condition until they hit about the age of 16 when they don't start menstruating and they go to the doctor and the doctor's like, well, I got some bad news for you. It turns out that you're actually genetically male, that you have really high levels of testosterone, but your body can't sense the testosterone. And so all your outer parts look very female because that's the default position. But genetically, you were male, but obviously you identify as female because like you didn't have the testosterone act on your brain because your brain doesn't have any testosterone receptors. It doesn't have any androgen receptors.
Do
Doesn't have
you
working
think that
function.
people like Jimbob and Andrew are like even like tangentially aware or like in any capacity aware
I have no
of
idea.
all of this amount
Right.
of nuance and subtlety and diversity in
Probably.
the biological aspects of
Yeah,
sex
I
and
think
gender?
so. I mean, I'd be curious. That's one reason why I'd be interested in talking to Jim Bob or Andrew, like to get a sense of like, do you even fucking know any of this stuff? And just how complicated this is? Because like
Usually
obviously, yeah, it's like
usually when I talk with people that make the type of arguments that
Mhm.
Jim Bob and Andrew are making, it's like it's honestly like pulling teeth to even get these people to understand that sex and gender are meaningfully different concepts. Like they
Sure.
represent meaningfully different things. And even getting them to understand that much is like a step too far for most
Mhm.
of these people.
Right. I think like the way to kind of make that simple is that male is the term we use to describe the masculine form in animals, and female is the term we use to describe the feminine form in animals. A woman is a female, typically, and then a man is a male, typically. But the thing is, so we wouldn't refer to like a male dog as a man, right? And we wouldn't refer to a female dog as a woman.
Or a
Those are
baby.
terms right? Like those are human terms.
Yeah, like a human baby is a male, but it's not a man.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's a baby. Right. Exactly. Or it's a boy.
As we all know, you are not a man until you've had your bar mitzvah.
So, right. Exactly. Right. You got to hit that 13 year, but you got to have the whole party. Uh-huh. Exactly. Yep, that's exactly right. Or in the upper Midwest where I grew up, it's you're not a man until you like, shoot something with a gun.
Well,
Um
I'm from Texas, so that would have made me a man at a very
probably
young
applied
age.
there as well.
A very young age, I became a man.
Yeah, same here. So, yeah, that of course, right? So, and some of that, I think, like I know, I get the sense that Andrew has obviously probably heard a lot of this stuff. I've seen like people bring this stuff in front of Ben Shapiro, and he often will try to say like, well, everyone brings up the intersex condition as if these are actually people with a sort of medical designation and you're drawing them into this debate and it's not about this debate. look, we are learning about human biology from the intersex condition, and it tells us and it informs us a lot about brain development and all of the different kinds of pathways that it can take. And my case is that transgenderism, one, we already know from studies that show that some people who identify as transgender, they don't even know they have an intersex condition. And it turns out that they do. So already that's part of it. And that for many people who are transgender are likely have some underlying biological intersex condition, probably largely restricted to the brain, not something that's genetic per se, but is something that happened within the course of brain development that resulted in the fact that they have brain circuits that are either something in between male and female or are trans in some way. And the thing is, we do know that there are brain circuits that are involved in this. Okay, so I'm gonna skip.
I have
Yes,
come across they'll be like, oh well, you're just bringing up some like edge case, some 1 in a million type of
yeah,
thing. Like they downplay the
right,
amount of intersex variance that there is in the
yes,
population. They downplay all this. They say, or they'll say, yeah, okay, I agree that trans people have brains where their brains might be more similar to the gender that I identify with than the sex that they were born as. Okay, yeah, I acknowledge all that. That's a scientific reality, but it's not normal, and they should be, they just should be corrected. It's a mental disease. It's a disorder. Like I hear that line of argumentation, and I
right.
hear like from Ben Shapiro, like yeah, they'll say like, oh well, the intersex, that's just an exception to the rule, and it
Yes,
doesn't disprove the rule. And I hear those two lines of argumentation. So for the Ben Shapiro's one, like if you're the type of person that tries to argue that sex or gender are binary, and you say, oh well, intersex is just an exception, like there are no exceptions for binaries.
yes,
Like
exactly.
binaries cannot have exceptions, otherwise
Binaries
they're
cannot have
not
exceptions.
binaries.
Yes, exactly. That's
Exactly.
exactly
Like
right. And the fact that, like, when we talk about sex, the differences between sexes, there are some things that are dimorphisms, but most things are differences. And that for those things that are differences, they are not dimorphic. So many differences in the brain, even, are differences and aren't necessarily dimorphic. There are a couple of things that are dimorphic, for instance, the sexually dimorphic nucleus of the preoptic area. But many areas of the brain, on average, will be larger in males than they are in females. I think I skipped this slide. Yeah, this. Okay, so this is
before
actually
before
super.
we get
Mhm.
too far off
Yeah. Mhm.
off, I did want to just address
Yeah.
the what I brought up about the people that, like the transphobes that will acknowledge all of this. They'll
Right.
acknowledge the scientific realities and just say, well, those are freaks, those are mutants, they need to be corrected and culled or whatever, like kind of vile extreme position they have. And it just sort of like, it just seems like they want to redefine what like an actual like mental illness is, to where like for something to qualify as a mental illness, it has to like be messing with your ability to like function. Like it has to be
Yes.
like actually hindering
Right.
your ability on the day to day. And like in a society that doesn't like oppress and like in a society that is accepting of trans people, like being trans does not affect your life on a functional level like that. Like you can still be productive, you can still be functional,
Of
you can
course.
still maintain healthy relationships. Being trans is not a mental illness because it
No.
doesn't affect your life like a mental illness would in a debilitating way. So
The only way that it does debilitate someone is that if they're in a part of society, or if they're facing oppression, that's the only way that it actually is debilitating. If they find acceptance, if they're in communities that are accepting of
yeah,
of who they are,
otherwise,
they thrive, and then they actually do quite well.
so
Right.
yeah, like that is what separates it apart, because I hear all the time these people saying, "Oh, it's like a that it might be the case that their brain is telling them that they're like a different gender, but that's
Mhm.
just a mental illness, that's just a delusion, that's a disorder or whatever." And like this is why it's categorically not. This is why it's
Right.
separate from other things that are recognized as mental illnesses. This is why it's like literally just a normal like historically normal part of like neurodivergence, like
Yes.
basically just like the divergent aspects of a normal human population. You're going to have some
Exactly.
sort of neurodivergence that is going to result in like a healthy amount of trans people in your population. Like human populations, it seems like have typically always had some
Yes.
level of, you're
Something
going
on
to
the
have
order of about a 0.5% to 1%
yeah,
are
and
experiencing
it
some
gets
of this.
back. It gets back to Jimbob's initial topic for the stream about diversity being strength. Like in normal populations that are healthy and fit, you're going to have a lot of diversity in those populations, just as a normal, like healthy, robust reserve of variety, so you can handle multiple different situations that are thrown at you as a population.
Exactly. Right. So the thing about differences and degrees of difference. So when we talk about like brain size, for instance, in general, male brains are larger on average than female brains. So the blue represents male, the red represents female. Okay, so this is the average over time. What we're looking at here are MRI scans of individual boys and girls over development. And what you can see, so this is total visual tissue volume, and then you can break apart the brain into either gray matter, which is the part where largely filled with neurons, and then white matter is largely the areas of the brain that are the connections between neurons. Okay, so like this is the total, and then this would be the gray, and then this would be the white. So you add these up, and then you would have the total. But if you just look at total, you can see that brains are larger in males than in females on average. This is the average line here across age, and this is the for males, and then this is for females. Now, the other thing is that we have all the individual points on here too. So here's a male that had a very, very big brain. You can see it was really, really big at around age like 12 or something, got a little bit smaller over time by age 20. And you can see overall the trajectory is for it to be sort of at its peak size around 15 or 16. It starts to get smaller and smaller. I hate to tell everyone, but your brain's just getting smaller as you get older. But the point is that you can see that there are plenty of red dots above the blue line. These are females with big brains that are above average. So these are Brienne of Tarth brains. And then you can see that there are some blue dots in here that are below the red line. So there are males that are below the average of females. Now, this is a statistical difference. On average, males are going to have larger brains than females, but you're going to have some males that have smaller brains than the typical female. So, like Ben Shapiro, for instance, probably has a smaller brain than the average female. And of course, this is also true for gray matter and white matter. And right, so there are cognitive differences that work between males and females. But the thing is, when you get to uh, um, transgender individuals, it turns out that when you look at some of these areas that are different between males and females, so for instance, the body of the corpus callosum is typically, I believe it's so this is cis female, this is cis male. The body of the corpus callosum is I'm not entirely sure if this is indicating that this is larger in females than it is in males, even though I know that that's the direction. I'm trying to remember what MD is in this study. It's been a number of years since I looked at this study. But the point is, they have individuals in here. So this is cis male, this is cis female, and there's a difference here. From females to male transition, you can see that the average is something in between both males and females, and males to females. So people who are born male but identify as female, they are slightly larger than the typical cis male. And the same is true for other white matter tracts. So they found a number of areas that were somewhere in between, that the transgender individuals, and this is prior to any kind of treatment whatsoever, that they were something in between what is a cis female versus a cis male. And there are a number of other subtle differences. So these are differences, right? So you're going to find plenty. This is not a sexual dimorphism. You're going to find some individuals where the body of the corpus callosum, that's the axons that connect the left side of the left cortical hemisphere to the right cortical hemisphere, and vice versa. You're going to find some males that will be bigger than females and some females that will be bigger than males. But on average, there's a difference. And transgender individuals tend to be in between. And there's a number of other studies that show like the transgender cortex is more similar to the gender identity than their natal sex, so the sex that they were born with. So they have certain features that are more male-like for those individuals that were born female but identify as male, and then vice versa for those individuals that were born male but identify as female. Um, even whole brain areas such as the putamen, which is a very important part of the basal ganglia complex. So that in this study, they just happened to find that the right putamen is statistically different between males and females, but female to male transition. So these are people that were born female but identify as male are also slightly larger, statistically larger than the female condition than they are to the male condition. So there's something in between. So again, like transgender brains being somewhat more closer to their gender identity to their natal sex in some aspects. Um, we also know, obviously, that hormones like have a big part in shaping our brain areas. I'm gonna skip ahead with this, but the thing is, we also know that if you treat those individuals that have gender dysphoria, so that they get the hormone that matches their preferred sex, we see changes in their overall behaviors that tend to be sex differenced, such as spatial ability. So, spatial ability is something that typically males tend to do better on. In general, transgender individuals tend to perform better, or they tend to be somewhat in between the male versus female sex on a lot of these like sex difference cognitive tests. But if they get the hormone treatment, then they tend to be even more like their preferred gender, and that's what this is showing. So for people who are male, like who were born male but transition to female over time during the transition as they're getting sex hormone treatment, they end up being more female like, so they get worse and worse at spatial abilities. And for those individuals that were born female, but then got treatment to become male, they end up having more male like spatial abilities. And they were already starting a little bit more, say, male like just at the beginning. fMRI shows other aspects of the brain being more activated to match so certain brain patterns that appear during like spatial rotation tasks for people who are male to female transition. You can see that these are people born male, but they identify as female and they received hormone treatment. You can see that their brain pattern of activity for doing the spatial pattern is a lot more similar to the female condition, even though it's a male brain. You know, they were born male, but they received female gender affirming hormone therapy. You can see that they adopt having a brain pattern that's a lot more female like. We see this kind of thing over and over again. So it's like, the fact that the brain, one, already for transgender individuals tends to be at least in between the preferred the sexes. Like they don't necessarily clearly distinguish themselves as either being cis male or cis female. They almost are always on average in between for many different features of the brain. But then also with their cognitive abilities tending to be somewhere in between, but then when they get gender affirming hormone therapy, they end up being much more like their preferred sex. It's like, why are we even fighting this, right? Like we know the underlying biology to some degree would allow for a certain subset of individuals to be somewhat blended, and that like the kinds of treatments that we can offer those individuals to affirm their gender end up just making the condition just better for them overall.
I often do wonder, like, if technology advanced to such a degree to where you could actually just completely change your sex in a way that would be, indistinguishable. Like you would change your chromosomes, you would change your hormone profile, you would change your morphology. Like if you could have technology that was sufficiently advanced to just actually like 100% change sex,
Mhm.
um, would these people still be having issues with that? Like, or is it only the fact that like are they mad that they think that like trans women are not women? But
Yeah.
like if the technology was so advanced to where like their actual biological sex is completely indistinguishable
Right.
by every single metric,
Right. Like
and like
what's the
there would
objection
be
here?
no argument that you could ever say that they were not
Exactly.
women or not female or anything.
Right.
I
Like
think that these people would still have a problem, even though they
yeah,
couldn't articulate why, even though
right.
they would have no kind of like cohesive reason why they
Not
would
at
have a
all.
problem.
Yes.
They would
Like
still have a problem.
if you could take someone who is, say, born male, identifies as a woman, has undergone gender affirming hormone therapy, but obviously they still have XY chromosome arrangement. If you could just convert all of the cells to now have XX chromosome arrangement. Would that be sufficient? Is that the issue that they have a problem with? It obviously isn't, because
Yeah.
they're not going to object to, say, this woman who was born with congenital adrenal or complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, where so she's XY chromosomes. Every single cell in her body is XY chromosomes. She has testes. She has sky high levels of testosterone, like much higher than like the typical man, because she can't suppress the testosterone cannot have negative feedback on the brain because she doesn't have working androgen receptors. But she has a vagina. She was identified as a woman as from birth. Typically, this woman in particular, she has female-like behaviors. Almost every single woman with complete androgen insensitivity syndrome will show girl-like behaviors as a child. They usually are like heterosexual, so they'll prefer the company of men. They identify as women almost universally. But they have XY chromosomes. But they won't object to that. Like, they're not going to insist that this woman has to go into the men's bathroom.
Yeah, there's no consistency or coherency to it at all. When you actually get into the weeds and you start talking about actual biology, actual case studies, all of a sudden, like I don't know. I would actually like to see how they would try to square this circle with their worldview. Were you planning this whole time on going through this presentation and going through my debate?
I was thinking
I just want to point out we didn't even make it to the part of the debate where Andrew shows up.
I was just thinking about it because now, like, basically this entire stream is a lie. But I'd much rather just like have a conversation with you.
Yeah, this is great.
Okay, I'm glad that like you liked it. Hopefully, other people got something from it. I feel like that these are just issues that not enough people know that actually can be valuable rhetorical tools in persuading the general public to say, yeah, all right, I get it. Like, gender and sex isn't as simple as man and woman. It's not a binary in the strictest sense, that it's bimodal, and that sure, we have to acknowledge that that most men are cisgendered, most women are cisgendered, but that there's going to be some subset in between, because making a man out of a fetus or making a woman out of a fetus actually is a really complicated process, which normally goes right, quote unquote, for most people. But there's a lot of subtlety, especially when you're starting with an embryo that is a blend of both male and female characteristics. Even though it's XY or XX, the embryo grows with a blending of both male and female characteristics. And hormones are complicated. It's not strictly that like every single male fetus gets the same level of testosterone, or that it's going to act in the exact same way. You can take clones of an individual, like an individual boy, and put it in 1,000 uteruses. It's going to experience the hormonal surges in different ways. And I guarantee you that you're not going to end up with like fully 100% cisgendered boys, even though they're all entirely clones. But you're going to end up with some of them who are going to be trans. You're going to end up with even more of them that are going to be homosexual. You're going to have some that'll be, most of them will be heterosexual, and most of them will be cis. But some of them won't, even though they're exact clones of each other, because there's just so much that goes into growing a fetus. It's really, really complicated.
Yeah, I think that the biological aspect of this whole topic is oftentimes missed, and so that's why I appreciated you driving in on this stream, because oftentimes like this whole subject will be phrased as like a cultural issue,
right?
And on my channel, the channel formerly known as Based Theory, I largely deal with science versus pseudoscience debates, and that's how I approach this, because I think that this issue is essentially a science versus pseudoscience debate, because the transphobes are pushing pseudoscience.
Yep.
Like, if you actually look at our current scientific understanding of like how this whole thing shakes out. Obviously, we're still in our infancy of figuring out. Like, I mean, we don't know the specifics of where identity is generated in the brain, but we know it's generated in the brain.
Yes.
We know to a certain degree that this is biological. There is a biological side
Yes.
of this conversation to
That's
be
right.
had,
Exactly.
and the people on the other side of this, the people saying that sex is binary, that trans women are not women, that sex and gender are the same thing, those are pseudoscientific positions. Like,
It
that is pseudoscience that they're peddling. Those are, we know scientifically better. We have the empirical data that shows otherwise, that these transphobes are pseudoscientists, and so that's why, like, this issue is right at home on my channel, talking about other
Mhm.
instances of pseudosciences, from flat Earth to young Earth creationism, climate change denial, you name it. This is just, for me at least, and obviously I can say that because, like, I am cis. This is not my lived experience. Like, whenever I hear people making claims like this, it's not about my life necessarily. I can hear these claims and say, look, these are just empirically incorrect claims.
Right.
Like,
Yep.
these could be scientifically disputed based on the actual data of our reality. Like, the
Art.
claims that these
Yeah.
transphobes makes, on top of just being morally wrong, just being disrespectful, rude, just being, bad people in general,
Yep.
they're objectively incorrect on an
Objectively
empirical level
incorrect.
as well.
Yes. Right. And that's one of the things that I think I totally agree. It's a big part of where I come from this. I also I have a soft spot for any group that is being ostracized or discriminated against, especially if it's unjust. And it's totally unjust in this case. And it's really unfair because this is a group that historically has suffered from a lot of discrimination in the past. The transphobes are just, this is sort of a last breath for transphobia and this kind of thing. Of course, it's still strong. So some of my motivation comes from like wanting to protect and be an ally to people that deserve protection. But I also see it as from exactly the same position that you do too. That this is absolutely pseudoscience, and that we should be able to point out that the transphobes are practicing pseudoscience, just as people who maybe were dabbling in race science 50, 60 years ago were also dabbling in pseudoscience, right? It's the
Oh,
same
you
kind of thing.
you sweet summer child. There
Well,
are
okay.
there
I
are
mean,
still those
it's still
peddlers of
around. I
race
know.
science.
There are darker quarters, of course, where you see lots of race realism, for sure. But at least you don't have, an entire political party that's basically put most of their eggs in the transphobe basket, right? As we're seeing in this,
Which is at least
as we
incredibly electorally stupid of them. At
I would
least that's the
agree.
silver
Yeah.
lining.
Yeah. Like they're just I think for most people, they see this issue as like what do I care, right? Like most people like and that's one of the things that I love about the phrasing that that the Harris Waltz campaign has put. That you mind your own business, right? What do you care?
Yeah, get out of our bedrooms, get out of our doctor's offices.
Yes.
Don't
Mind
don't mess
mind your
with
own
our
business.
business, our private
Yes.
lives.
Right. What difference does it make to you? As we talked about at the beginning, like, uh, what difference does it make other than the fact that you might have to use some pronouns that you don't necessarily want to use? That seems stupid to me. How does that affect you really? Like, be real here.
It's really like the absolute bare least you could do.
Yes,
Like,
it
it
really is.
requires almost zero effort at all.
Exactly. Yes. I totally see it the same way. But the issues around like the people who argue on this issue, I see it the same exact way. It is peddling pseudoscience, and on my channel, I care about that. I've been involved with like skepticism for a very long time, and that's a big part of what I like to do on YouTube. Is the same thing. It's why I argue with the creationists and arguing on intelligent design and that kind of thing. But the trans issue I see very similarly. Like the science is on our side on this, and we shouldn't be afraid to point out the science, but the science, it's complicated, and so it requires some real careful thinking when you're trying to communicate it to the public. Obviously, like kind of going through graphs like the way that I did can be a lot to wade through. But there are ways that this could be more distilled in a way that you could use it as a rhetorical weapon against like the people that are peddling the transphobe pseudoscience. Right.
Exactly. And that's at least what I attempted to do in
I know.
this. Although I didn't set out, obviously, this was a surprise debate. I didn't know I would be debating these
Yeah.
issues. But in this debate that we would have listened to, I think I did an all right job of
I think you
walking
did
that
fine.
fine
Yes,
line.
absolutely.
And
I think that you were focused though more, and I probably will revisit the stream again. I don't know. I'm gonna see what your Jimbob conversation is like
yeah,
too.
for those of you listening, the full conversation with Jimbob and Andrew is going to be going public on my channel like tomorrow, so you can catch the whole thing there. Because we didn't really we covered maybe 30 seconds of it.
Right, exactly. We really did. And we're now at an hour and 45 minutes, so it's plenty of time. We're not going to watch more now. So, but I probably will be revisiting it. I might download the video and maybe make a separate video from this. Feel free to take this if you like, if you want to rehost it or whatever. If you want to use parts, this is fine too.
Yeah, this was a great conversation.
Sure. Yeah, I'm glad.
Thanks for having me and reaching out to me to have me on for this.
No, I've been super impressed with your rise. Like you've been a real gem in on the right side of the pseudoscience debate.
Well, thank
And
you very much. And keep your eye out because I've got some big plans this fall for I'm still gonna keep doing the pseudoscience debates, and I still want to keep doing the weekly call-in streams. But I have a pretty big idea for how to change up the format in a way that I think is really exciting and unique. So keep your eyes peeled.
yeah, we'll definitely do. All right. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for taking time out of your trip to come out here for almost 2 hours. It's now almost 11:30 here on the East Coast, so I'm gonna go to bed. Yeah, we'll keep in touch for sure. Like I said, this is an issue I actually care about. I know most of the content on my page has been either just on basic neuroscience stuff or on creation evolution stuff. I've got a couple of things that I've been doing with this Virginia preacher who posted some video on basically like genetics and chimpanzees and blah blah blah. And he also talked about ERVs. So I've been working on trying to get a video up on ERVs. So I'm going to be doing that kind of soon. Trying to touch on some issues that have not been touched on with respect to ERVs. Like a lot of times with the ERV debate, especially on YouTube, a lot of it gets colored by the kinds of stuff that Standing for Truth talks about. So a lot of creationists adopt a lot of his arguments. And like some of it, I don't know. There's some things
but Chris, Syncytin is functional.
I know. That's one of the things I want to talk about. Because it's true. It's one of around 20,000 some ERVs.
That's my biggest gripe with creationists using ERVs is that almost universally, almost every single time I've ever heard an ERV argument from a creationist, it's almost 100% just them not understanding fractions. Yes. Like it boils down to that every time. It's totally. Like, but this is functional. Okay, and what fraction of the overall is that?
Yes, and then exactly. So that's what I want to do. I want to talk about the functional ones and what fraction that is. And that's what I want to focus on because I don't feel like there's a good video out there explaining it. Simply explained. I think he does these really great animations. I forget his name, John something. He's a fantastic science communicator. He's got an awesome video on ERVs and showing just how unlikely it is that both chimpanzees and humans would have the same, almost virtually the same arrangement of only one class of ERVs across the chromosomes of both species. And that it's like, it's 1 to, like 170 some zeros odds, like there are more atoms in the universe than like the odds that like that can come about by chance. Yeah. Already that's enough to like, okay, this is stupid. And that's only one of the many ERVs that are found in the genome.
Well, it's a good thing that we have an intelligent designer.
Right? I know. Who would load up our genomes with these broken viruses.
Yeah, it's a good thing we have a Deus Ex Machina to just magically, fix any situation. So,
That somewhere about 4 to 5 times of our genome is dedicated to ERVs than it is to the actual protein coding genetic sequences.
yeah.
Okay.
Did you see that that recent study of the reason why the lungfish genome is so huge? Because I've like wondered why. Because like lungfish
Yeah.
genomes, just as a general rule, are just like some of the largest of all tetrapods,
No.
if not the largest, and or like the largest of all like animals, I think.
Mhm.
And they just came out with a study that there's like some gene network that's involved in like suppressing transposons, and
Mm.
in lungfish that's turned off. So the transposons, like these self-interested gene elements that are basically like these like parasitic aspects of your genome that are like not viruses, but they're just parts
Mhm.
of your genome that jump around and are
Yep.
interested in themselves primarily, not you.
Yes.
And those parts of their genomes just went wild in
Oh,
lungfish.
awesome.
And that's why their genomes are just so enormous.
Mhm. That's interesting. Oh, I had not seen that. I'm gonna have to check that out. I can look that up. Uh, that'll be pretty easy to find.
Yeah.
That's super cool. Yeah, and that's the other thing. Like, genome size varies enormously across so many species. Humans are sort of typical. There are plenty of other species that have even bigger genomes, like lungfish, especially have
Yeah.
much bigger genomes.
They just found a
Yeah,
fern that has like some of the the most amount of base pairs like ever
right.
recorded for a
Yes, right. I
multicellular
did see
organism.
that. Like, it's this tiny little fern,
Yeah.
and it has like this huge genome. Yes,
And I
it's
mean,
like
even like the common onion plant has 4
Mhm.
times
4
as
times, and the
much
fern, I
base
think it was
pairs.
something like 50 times the
The which
size of
was?
the fern. I think it was something like 50 times
Yeah,
the
yeah,
size of the
somewhere
human.
around there.
Yeah. So it's like, okay, right, yeah, like, you're gonna tell me that somehow, like, they don't have a whole bunch of junk in their DNA?
Well, the intelligent designer just knew that onions were 4 times as complicated as a human being designed in his own image.
And that therefore pufferfish, which also have very small genomes, are something on the order of, like, 1/6 the complication of a human being?
Yeah, I mean, those are like starter Pokemon of animals.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. Yeah, and then but the fern is the biggest.
Yeah, that's the
That's the
legendary.
Charizard.
Yeah.
That's funny. Oh man. All right. Well, it's good having you on here. We'll keep in touch. And anything comes up, if you want to like have me on to talk about something too, I'm happy to chat
Yeah,
and continue to do this. Yep. I love watching your stuff.
definitely.
I do watch it all the time.
Oh, that's nice. Cause yeah, don't be a stranger. I felt like it had been a minute
Yep.
since I've gotten to catch up with you. So this was
Definitely.
definitely a ton of fun to
Good.
be on your stream. So definitely
Cool.
don't be a stranger. Keep in touch.
For sure.
And thanks for having me.
Yeah, definitely. All right. We'll check you later. All right. Bye, everybody.